Edge highlighting is one of the first and most fundamental techniques that we need to learn as miniature painters to get great looking models. The truth is though, it can actually be really challenging. Edge highlighting takes quite a lot of control to get nice, neat, consistent lines. In this video, I'm going to give you 6 tips on how to improve your edge highlights. So what are edge highlights and why do we do them? Edge highlights are ultimately a layer of paint that goes along the edge of a sharp line to separate one part of the model from the other. Ultimately, the reason why we try to do this is because the most important thing for us to try and to achieve for good looking models is clear readability and separation of shapes. We want our viewer to look at our model from far away and be able to clearly understand exactly what they are looking at nice and easily. Edge highlights are incredibly powerful when doing this. So here are some tips to get you started. The first one that we need to talk about is paint consistency. Paint consistency is incredibly important because if your paint is too thin, it's not going to cover very well and you're going to have to do multiple lines, and also it might flow around and you're going to lose control. But if your paint is too thick, then what's going to happen is you're not going to get a nice flowing brush mark and you're going to end up with torn lines. Now, I wish I could give you a magic description on what your consistency should be, but it doesn't work because every paint is different. Some are thinner, some are thicker. The best thing that I can do is try to explain to you exactly what you are looking for. The paint that we have on screen is Games Workshop Corn Red. This is a relatively thick paint. It's definitely too thick for what we're trying to achieve, so it requires thinning. As you can see on the screen right now, as I pull that corn red away on my brush, you can see that that corn red is sticking to my brush. It's not flowing back into shape very well, and it's almost creating strings of paint from the brush to the paint puddle itself. It's trying to stay attached. This tells us this paint is too thick and it doesn't have enough fluidity to it. So what we need to do is we need to try to break that surface tension of that paint so that paint flows back into shape. But we don't want to thin it too much because ultimately then we're going to lose control when we're doing our brush stroke, and we're going to have to do multiple brush strokes because it's not going to cover very well. So what we're going to aim for here is we're going to add small amounts of water just up until the point where the paint breaks its surface tension and starts to flow back into shape and stops trying to stay attached to that paintbrush. And this is what you're aiming for a good paint consistency when edge highlighting. You want this paint to flow back into shape so you don't have any resistance when you do your brush stroke, and you want to be able to just do these edge highlights once with one brush stroke, so you want your paint to maintain as much of the opacity as possible. The second tip is brush loading. There are 3 parts of the brush that's relevant to this conversation right now: the tip, the belly, and the ferrule. We do not want any paint to go near the ferrule of the brush because we can damage the brush. We want paint to go into the belly of the brush, but not too much. And we want paint to obviously be on the tip because that's what we're going to use to actually paint. Now, the more paint you have in the belly of the brush, the more it is going to force that paint out onto the model. So it's important that we don't overload it. So when we're loading our brush up, we want the tip covered in paint, and we also want, let's say, as an example, half the belly to have paint in it. You can see from the example on screen. Now, what also happens is when you're loading that brush, we nearly always have too much paint on that brush. So what you need to do is you need to remove the excess on a piece of kitchen roll. Some people use their hands. I tend to find kitchen roll is more forgiving because it absorbs a lot of excess liquid that you might have. So what you do is you load your brush up halfway, as we said. You drag your paintbrush along the kitchen roll, and you also twist the paintbrush as you go because it restores the point. And we do this every time we get new paint on the brush to restore that point and give us a nice consistent line. Generally speaking, the edges that we're painting are sharp angles, and we can run the side of the brush along that edge and it should give you a nice consistent line. If your paint is too thick, that line might be torn, or if your paint is too thin or the brush is overloaded, it might leave too much paint on the model and you can end up with a very inconsistent line and quite large blobs of paint on it. Now, when it comes to the painting with the side of the brush, my recommendation would be to do your edge highlight with the side of the brush closer towards the tip. There are a couple of reasons for this. First of all, there are going to be times when you have to use the tip of your brush because the edge that you're trying to get to is very shallow and you're going to be forced to use the tip. So it's good practice to get into that practice. The next thing is if you use the side of the brush towards the tip of the brush, what ends up happening is you're putting less pressure on the belly of the brush, which is where all the paint is held, and you're going to have less chance of putting too much pressure on the belly and all of the paint being forced out. Lastly, a good reason for using the side of the brush closer towards the tip is a narrower part of the brush, and generally speaking, it's going to be easier to give you a nice thin line consistently across the model, as opposed to the belly, which is a fatter part of the brush, so it's got more contact area and will potentially give you a thicker line on the edge highlight, especially if you're still trying to improve the control. And if you are finding this video helpful so far, make sure you hit the like button, leave a comment in the comment section below, let us know what you think. It makes a huge difference to the channel and we greatly appreciate it. Now the truth is sometimes there's going to be points where you're not going to be able to use the side of your brush. Maybe it's because you want this line in a recess. Sometimes when you're painting organic shapes, you might want a nice crisp line in the recess of a model to define a muscle or something along those lines. Or, let's be honest, not all models are perfect, and sometimes the nice crisp clean edge that you're trying to edge highlight isn't so crisp and clean and is actually quite soft, and your brush is just giving you a messy result. In these cases, what we have to do is we have to paint with the tip of the brush. Now, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you this is easy to do. It's actually incredibly challenging. But if you do want to try and get a nice, neat, crisp line with the tip of your brush, this might help. An issue that a lot of people have when they're trying to do nice, crisp, clean brush strokes is they can have shaky hands. Obviously, some people have got this as a medical issue, and that's a little bit different. But the majority of us, we just have shaky hands because maybe we don't get enough sleep, maybe we drink too much coffee, whatever the reason is. A good tip to help try and manage this is just purely to exhale as you do your brush stroke. It will settle your brain and settle your hand. The next thing is always do your brush stroke going towards your wrist. This is called a pull stroke and it gives you the most control. And lastly, like we talked about with loading the brush, make sure when you unload the excess paint off of your brush, you twist that brush along the kitchen roll. This will restore the point and give you a nice, crisp, clean line, dependent on your abilities. Like I said, this part is incredibly difficult and does come with practice and experience, but don't be disheartened. Not everything needs to be perfect. And when we're painting miniatures, one of the things that we try to do is we try to create depth and we try to define shapes, and we do this by creating value contrast. And what this basically means is we try to go from light to dark to help define a shape. One of the reasons why we do this is purely to enhance readability. We're trying to accentuate the shapes that we've been given so it's easy for people to understand what they're looking at. The reality is with edge highlighting, we do exactly the same. If you just edge highlight with one color, it's going to define the shape, but it's not going to be particularly exciting. So if you're going to invest in edge highlights, my suggestion would be do multiple. So for example, if you're painting a gray gun casing, use your nice gray, then add a brighter gray in smaller areas. And then what this does is it makes it pop. This adds depth and makes your edge highlights far more interesting and will just make your work much more striking in general. Lastly, the final tip that I'm going to give you is a little bit more of an advanced one, the brush stroke itself. Now, I appreciate that a lot of people who are probably watching this video looking for tips for edge highlights are potentially going to be more of a beginner painter. There's nothing wrong with that. This is just something to think about for the future. What we do generally with the brush stroke on an edge highlight is we don't want a hard finish to that edge highlight. We don't just want it to end abruptly because it can look very, very jarring. So one of the things we do as miniature painters is we adjust our brushstroke to give us something which looks a little bit more natural. With this, there are two ways that you can do this. You can start your brushstroke off the model and you can curve it onto the actual model itself. And then what this does is as you curve it onto the model, it gradually increases pressure and it gives you a nice feathered result. You can also do it the other way and you can start your brushstroke on the model and you can gradually pull the brush off of the model at the end of the brushstroke, and this gives you a gradual finish, a gradual feathered finish towards the end of the brushstroke. It means your edge highlights look much more natural and you get a much more natural looking transition, which is far more appealing. And that's it for this video. Thank you everyone for watching. It means a huge amount to me. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. Is this video helpful, and what would you like to see in the future? As always, if you do want to support, make sure you hit the like button. It means a massive amount to us. Hit subscribe to see more. And as always, if you want more in-depth video content from us, feel free to check out the members area or the Patreon. Cheers.